Hello. Thank you for being back. I'm glad that the dropout rate is not so high after the lunch. So we have really interesting presentations in this panel. I'm very happy to moderate. So and we'll start right away. So we get to enjoy a little bit of sun after we are done with the program. So I'd like to introduce Josh Compton and Adam. Adam is here as well. Hi, Adam. So Josh, the floor is yours. 15 minutes. Thank you very much. And we have inoculation theory.
So inoculation theory has long been considered the grandparent theory of resistance to influence. But if you take a closer look at that early research, I think it's giving more grandpa than it is grandparent, because it is clearly based on a default system as that those who are doing the persuasion and those who are trying to resist the persuasion are men. And you don't even have to look that close either. You don't have to read between the lines, just read the actual lines. That first study back in 1961, you can't even get through the first sentence without first encountering your first use of a his, him, he pronoun. And the really rich part of this is that if you look into the footnotes, you'll find out that that study, that first 1961 inoculation theory study, actually included more women than men at a ratio of about 7-4. So women have always been part of the story of inoculation theory. They just haven't been part of the cover of the book, right? You really have to dig in to figure out the role. Now, fortunately, that's changing, and researchers have begun taking a much closer look at the potential implications of gender and inoculation theory, both as the inoculator and as the inoculatee. But we still have a lot more room to go. And so that's what Adam and I want to talk with you about this afternoon, about what we know about how gender and inoculation theory work and what we might know next. Now, Adam and I have come up with what I think are some pretty neat ideas for where inoculation theory and gender research could go next. But our hope is that you'll come up with even better ideas. And so you can top what we're going to present to you. So when I first learned about inoculation theory 30 plus years ago, one of the things I loved about it was because unlike a lot of social science theories, this theory's name actually explains what it is. If you say the name inoculation theory of resistance to influence, you've pretty much defined the inoculation theory of resistance to influence, because that's the premise. That individuals can be inoculated against future attitude attacks in much the same way they can be inoculated against future viral attacks. So if you think about your conventional flu shot, you go in, you're injected with a weakened version of the flu virus. It's not strong. It's not strong enough to actually give you the flu, but it is strong enough to trick your body into thinking that it's being invaded. And so your body's motivated to produce some antibodies to fight that off. And McGuire found, and as we've subsequently confirmed over the last 60 plus years of inoculation theory research, is that our attitudes, our values, and our beliefs work in much the same way. If we can encounter a weakened form of a persuasive attack, that motivates our bodies to start producing refutations against that attack, thereby inoculating us against the persuasion. The core thing that seems to be going on with inoculation theory is threat. Now, threat means something really particular in inoculation theory research. We're not talking about an actual physical thing that's scaring us. We're talking more about that feeling of vulnerability that we sometimes get when we realize there are some really good arguments out there that run counter to what we currently believe. Arguments that are strong enough that they make us nervous. They make us nervous enough that we start to think about the reasons why we hold those beliefs. And that's how we're defining threat in inoculation theory research. This sense of recognized vulnerability, this perception that an existing position, once thought safe from change, was actually at risk. One of the ways that we try to elicit this threat is really obvious. We just come right out and just warn them. We say, look, you have the right idea on this issue, but there are people out there who are going to try to change your mind. And their arguments are going to sound so convincing that you might actually waver. That's the most common way that we generate threat in inoculation messages. But we also do it through something called preemption. In fact, this is the prototypical method for designing an inoculation message, what we might call a two-sided message. We throw out some counter arguments, some arguments that you might encounter later, and we pre-refute those, or we pre-butt them. And that's much the same way that in a medical vaccine, we take the virus and tinker with it, make it safe enough so that it's not actually going to, in persuasion, change your mind, but it's dangerous enough that it's going to motivate that process of resistance. In the body, we'd call those antibodies. In the mind, we might call those things like refutations. The same processes seem to be at work, and we could leave it right there. And throughout much of my early work with this theory, that is where I left it, because that was a safe and comfortable place to sit. But inoculation in persuasion is much like inoculation in medicine. It's a lot more complicated than we initially thought. And the more research that we do into persuasion as an inoculation model, the more we realize that the picture can get really messy. And we can end up doing some structural equation modeling like this, where we find that it's not just a position that encounters weak arguments that then makes you stronger, resisting to stronger ones. It's attitude accessibility, it's emotions, it's initial attitude, it's our perceived involvement level, it's the strength of the claims being made, it's the concreteness of the message content, and the list goes on and on. And, more on this in a minute, it's gender. But we have found that inoculation works across a bunch of different contexts. So I'm just going to give a really quick overview before we get into the inoculation and gender part. In fact, politics is probably one of the most common places in which we've seen inoculation being applied. We pretty much know now who it works with, what it works against, which voters are most susceptible to it. You can inoculate against candidates' attacks based on image, based on policy positions, really based on anything. The only study that we found so far where inoculation failed was my dissertation back in 2004. The subtitle of that dissertation should be the one where Compton proposed 36 hypotheses in a very audacious way and only supported 4 of them by the end of the dissertation. But one of the things that we did find was that you can't inoculate, at least in my study, against late-night political humor. So if you're trying to warn people about attacks that are going to be launched in joke form, you're actually better off just letting them mock you, because your sociability ratings actually go up when that happens. If you inoculate first, all your credibility ratings go down. We also see it in health. That makes sense, right? A theory name for a health process probably fits with health, and it does. It fits really well. We've designed inoculation theory-based campaigns that have helped young kids resist temptations to engage in smoking cigarettes. We've designed one I did with some colleagues of mine in the University of Kentucky. We found that if you inoculate college students against temptations to engage in binge drinking, it does help protect them against some of that peer pressure. But even cooler, it extends beyond that specific issue and actually affects other risky behaviors too. So we found not even mentioning safer sex practices like condom usage got an uptake in support from the college students after being inoculated against the risky behavior of binge drinking, without even mentioning condom usage or safer sex practices in the actual study. So in a way then, persuasion inoculation is even more impressive than medical inoculation. Okay, you might not buy that, but it is that way in a way. And that's that if I get a flu shot, I'm not protected against COVID, right? But in some of these inoculation messages, we found that it actually does result in cross protection. We also see it used in commerce, things like public relations, advertising. One of my early studies found that you could inoculate college freshmen against predatory credit card marketing. So you could prepare them to resist the onslaught of ad appeals specifically targeting them. And we find it used in science communication. You can inoculate against climate change myths. And you can even use it in and against and with education. One of my favorite studies, we found you could inoculate college students against public speaking anxiety. So we could actually give them a message 2 weeks before their class presentations. It lowered the degree of negative or dangerous public speaking anxiety, but didn't eliminate it completely Fortunately, we don't want that. We don't want there to be no energy behind the presentations. But what it did that was really cool was lowered the negative amounts of public speaking anxiety and repackaged the anxiety that was existing as something beneficial, as something positive, as something like speaker enthusiasm. We use it in sport too. You can inoculate fans, for instance, against a losing season. As I mentioned earlier, there's been some work, not enough, but some work in how inoculation theory might interact with gender as well. So let me just quickly give you the headlines here before I turn it over to Adam for where we think this research could go next. The first study was actually cutting edge. It was in 1969. It was only 8 years after McGuire first introduced inoculation theory. The results a little bit convoluted. Basically found that females lowered their evaluations of the derogated source more than did males, thus supporting earlier evidence that females are more responsive to characteristics of people than are males. However, this responsiveness didn't carry over to resistance. What I think that basically means is that women were more in tune to source derogation inoculation messages, that those resonated more with the women in this sample, but that didn't translate over to resistance to the persuasive messages. They felt worse about the person making these claims, but they were still convinced at the same level that men were about the persuasive arguments. It wouldn't be until 1990 that scholars returned to a specific focus on gender and inoculation. Pfau and Burgoon found that, again, a gender effect was mainly based on their perceptions of the source credibility of the candidate supported in the attack message. And they found something similar in their book-length treatment of this project called Attack Politics, also from 1990, that found that, again, in issues of source credibility, women seem to be influenced the most. But in this study, they found when it actually came to strength of the resistance, men were more affected by the inoculation messages. Bounce to some that are a little more recent. This one from 1995 also found that women were more susceptible to inoculation-based PR messages from the Mobil Oil Company. Then again, Pfau and his colleagues in 2006 found that if one wanted to inoculate Americans against decreasing their support for U.S. military involvement, then they could, and it worked best with women than it did men. The other studies since then have not looked specifically at gender as an actual dependent variable. It simply looked at gender as a covariate. And after study, after study, after study, after study, I wasn't thinking about how long it would take to push this button as I went through these, we would find the same thing again and again and again. And that's when gender is used as a covariate in these studies. They found no differences based on gender on the effects of resistance to influence. So you can tell we've got a lot of work to do. We know some things, but there's no cohesive story bringing this together. And there certainly needs to be for us to actually build on this knowledge. So I'm going to turn it over to Adam, known in your program as an independent scholar, but known to me as my former student, to talk about some areas in which this research could go next.
Okay, we'll go fast. So thank you, Professor Compton. And all right, we have 3 minutes, so we'll do a speed run. It'll be fun. So besides the fact that SARS so generously invited us all here today, the main reason why we're all together is because we know that gender plays a huge role in how we communicate, lead, and respond to persuasion. And so I think 3 key areas of future research are leadership credibility, sports, coaching, and gender, and then gender and health communication. So I guess in my 2 minutes and 30 seconds-ish, we'll walk through each one. We'll do a survey. So we'll start with leadership credibility. So there's research from 2018 that kind of shows that when male leaders speak out in support of gender equity, they're often seen as selfless, caring, and altruistic. The problem is that when female leaders say the same thing, they're often viewed as self-promoting, insincere, and calculating. And so inoculation theory can actually help in this particular area. First, it starts with recognizing the threat that their motives might be unfairly questioned. By acknowledging that risk up front, female leaders can frame their support of these initiatives not as personal advocacy, but rather as smart business decisions. A second key area is sports and coaching. So research by Howell and Giuliano in 2011 found that when coaches swear, it actually damages their credibility more with female athletes than with male athletes. So the question for inoculation scholars is, what can we do, or what can coaches do better besides not damn cursing at, besides that? So what they can do is they could actually use inoculation theory to get ahead of it. That means they can preempt the threat. They could AKA acknowledge that swearing might be taking the wrong way before the season actually starts, and then refute it up front by explaining that their intensity, even the occasional curse, comes from freaking passion, not disrespect. And so this would build trust, reduce backlash, and strengthen the bond between coach and athletes. And then real quickly, the third area that we can look at in terms of where we could apply inoculation, oop, I skipped a slide, but believe me, it's gender and health communication. So basically, this applying inoculation theory here can literally save lives, because there's research that shows that in public health crises, I mean, COVID, for example, as we all just lived through, female leaders often use empathetic, community-focused messaging, while male leaders tend to make a more direct, assertive approach. The threat, and where inoculation theory comes in, is that not all audiences respond the same way. It's possible that men and women and other folks respond differently to different types of messaging. Either way, by studying these patterns, we can refute this one-size-fits-all model and build public health messages that actually stick. So, big takeaway here, inoculation theory is very powerful. It works across so many gendered spaces and helps us move closer to real equity. In sports, it can help coaches build trust by setting expectations and reframing intensity as passion. In business, it can help female leaders preempt skepticism by framing their support for equity as a strategic decision, not as a personal agenda. And in health, it can help communicators tailor messages to match audience needs. So basically, by applying inoculation theory through a gender lens, which there needs to be a lot more research doing, we can build stronger communication. And please, in the Q&A and in general, let us know your ideas. We're trying to expand this field and so on and so forth. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much. This was awesome. Thank you. This was lecture in public speaking as well. Thank you. Excellent. Thank you. Very inspiring. Thank you. So our next presentation is by Leticia, Riley, and Kunchika about stitching refutations, debunking misogyny and misinformation on TikTok. So, yeah, thank you very much. And the floor is yours.
Do I need the microphone? Okay, great. Hi, everyone. I'm Kunjika. And we're both master students at the Communication, Culture, and Technology program at Georgetown University. We present this study to you, which was conducted as part of our Misinformation and Society class with Professor Leticia Bori. It was conducted from January 2024 to May 2024. In terms of flow, this is how we're going to do in the 15-ish minutes we have. We'll start with the introduction, get into our methods, and then discuss our results and findings. As defined by the United Nations Population Fund, misogyny online functions as technology-facilitated gender-based violence, or TFGBV, gendered violence that is either created or disseminated using digital media. TFGBV is often considered less harmful than online forms of misogyny, but it has been shown to have serious physical and emotional effects on women and often creates a cyclical effect, leading to offline violence and creating a direct threat to the physical safety of women. The anonymity provided by these spaces allows for more extreme behaviors that defy standard social norms due to the lack of supervision and tangible accountability. Over the past decade, online platforms have been increasingly utilized to spread misogynistic ideas and to establish manosphere communities where women are painted as the root cause of unhappiness. These communities use violent, toxic, and misogynistic language as tools to empower themselves by releasing their frustrations and anger accumulated in reality. So that brings us to the combination of misogyny and misinformation on social media. A study conducted in 2014 showed that almost 90% of men hold some bias towards women. The combination of these existing biases towards women, alongside the extreme behaviors encouraged by anonymity online, is extremely conducive to the spread of misinformation and misogyny. And when these viewpoints are consistently reinforced by personalized algorithms that have been shown to increase the visibility of misogynistic content, it results in users engaging in an endless cycle of misogynistic messaging. This repetition, often invoking the illusory truth effect, which shows that repeated exposure to information, whether factual or not, increases belief in its validity. The question of how to combat misogyny is partly one of how to combat the misinformation upon which it is built.
So all of this contextual information that Kunjika has provided brings us to our research question. How do different kinds of refuter characteristics, respectively gender and race, affect belief in a misogynistic and a misinformation claim? In terms of our experiment, we utilized a 3x2x2 design, the 3 being misinformation claims, misogynistic claims, and a claim that was both misogynistic and included misinformation. The 2x2 included white and black refuters across male and female identities. Our participants were first tasked with answering a pre-exposure survey that collected their demographic information and existing belief in misogyny. They answered simple questions such as, do women work out on a Likert scale? And their aggregate score across questions gave us a sense of their existing misogynistic beliefs. Our refuters replicated the stitch function on TikTok, which lets users clip a short segment from someone else's video, incorporating it into their own. This is a way that users can engage with existing content by adding commentary or reactions while keeping part of the original video for context. Each of our refuters partook in 3 stitches, one refuting just the misogyny, one refuting the misinformation, and one refuting both the misinformation and the misogyny. Our original poster was claiming that women don't work out because they cannot handle the discomfort, but that they should be working out because they have a responsibility to take care of themselves and the quote unquote nice bodies that they had been born with. While our script was intended to mimic the sassiness of discourse on TikTok, it's also informed by a number of empirical studies dismantling the sexist assumption that women are incapable of handling discomfort, which is the misinformation claim that we used in our videos. In contrast, when refuting the misogyny, we instead focused on the claim that women were born to look good and have a responsibility to take care of their bodies. Our experiment aims to classify between misogyny and misinformation to differentiate between the responses. Our original poster and refuters accounts feature our best attempt at neutral usernames, Sam and Alex respectively, which were chosen to mitigate any bias while ensuring that participants weren't primed. While we did have human actors, we did deepfake AI-generated faces on top of them in order both to protect the identities of our actors and in an attempt to standardize across age, perceived trustworthiness, and levels of attractiveness. Each take was filmed in the same environment using chest up, talking head framing, in an attempt to mimic the casual filming style that we typically see on TikTok. In other words, our videos were designed meticulously to emphasize TikTok's user interface. After exposure to the videos, participants responded to a second survey, analyzing the effectiveness of the refutation in both contexts. The stitching trend is particularly notable in the context of combating misinformation and addressing misogyny on TikTok, because TikTok's user base and algorithm are shown to engage with content that addresses these issues directly. Essentially, what we're interested in is studying both if what you say when making these refutations matters and if who is making the refutation has an effect, excuse me. In the next 2 videos, or in the next 2 slides, we've provided sample videos, both of our white men refuters, one refuting misinformation and one refuting misogyny. We've clipped the second video just in the sake of time, but note that the original poster is making the same claims across both videos. Okay, it seems like our video isn't gonna play, so I'll just
This is the one for misogyny.
All right, so who were exposed to these videos? Our sample was recruited participants through the online survey firm Connect, and we paid participants $3 to complete the survey, which took about 10 minutes as we figured out during pre-testing. The recruitment and data collection took place on April 23rd of 2024, and it took a total of just 3 hours to recruit our target 2,800 participants, roughly 200 per condition, all of whom had to be over 18, located in the United States, and able to complete the study on a desktop computer rather than a mobile device. Participants were roughly split by gender and somewhat racially diverse, but mostly white, with an average age between 30 and 39 years old. The sample uses TikTok more than the general population, with 65% of our participants being at least occasional TikTok users, comparatively to the 33% of the general US population. However, they all spend on average less than an hour on TikTok every day.
Coming to results, as seen in the table, any condition that included a message refuting misinformation successfully reduced belief in the misinformation, while those that refuted misogyny had no effect on the belief, as you can see here. It must be noted that these are substantively small but statistically significant impacts. For instance, the most effective correction came from a Black woman, reducing the mean belief in the misinformation statement from 1.40 in the control condition to 1.17 in the Black woman correcting misinformation condition. This brings us to the question of refuter characteristics, and in our experiment, we found that neither of the refuter characteristics, race or gender, had an effect on the misinformation claim or the misogyny claim. In general, consistent with previous research, we found that refuting misinformation was effective at reducing belief in misinformation. These effects were small in magnitude, so we do not intend to overstate them. But given the ceiling effect, since most of the sample was well informed on the issue to start with, we still believe this to be a meaningful finding. This is particularly important given the embedded nature of the misinformation we tested, intertwined with a more deeply held belief about misogyny. In contrast, the refutation stitches showed to participants were relatively ineffective at reducing belief in the specific misogyny claim, nor did they move people on the validated misogyny scale. This is perhaps not surprising, whereas opinions about how women exercise are probably not terribly ingrained in one's set of values or identity. The very belief of women's subordination to men or misogyny is the most persistent form of group discrimination in human history. It is also worth keeping in mind that levels of misogyny were extremely low in the sample. Among those in the baseline control condition, the mean was only 1.86 on a scale of 1 to 5. This could reflect the skewed nature of online convenience samples, such as the one we relied on. Finally, to our surprise, refuter characteristics did not, including their presented race and gender, generally did not play a role in how participants accepted information they offered. This may also be due to the consistency of emotional discharge expressed across all refuters, as display of emotion are effective techniques for coercion. However, we would be remiss not to point out that women and people of color are much more likely to be harassed online, and stitching refutations could very well make someone a target for such harassment.
We also wanted to address a few limitations of our study, the first being that we only focused on US adults. And while there's still much progress to be made, the US does score relatively high on the Women, Peace, and Security Index, suggesting that women are not as at risk or discriminated against compared to many other countries, and results might have been different if they were conducted in a different cultural context. Our study cannot conclude whether the impacts we see would last over any period of time, since participants were only observed immediately before and after exposure to our videos. In terms of study design, due to technical limitations, our study could only be conducted on a desktop, which did kind of take people out of the natural TikTok environment, as most people access TikTok on their phones. The believability of actors was also an issue, as the deepfake may have kind of taken people out of the natural environment. We really struggled to find realistic AI-generated images for both of our Black refuters, and we ended up having to use a different software for the faces of both of these refuters, which is an important implication not just for our study, but general conversations around AI as well. Perhaps the most important limitation is our sample strongly disliked our original poster, something that you guys might have noticed. He was quite grating, and this might have amplified the effects that we saw. A more likable misogynist who already had an existing rapport with his audience and therefore already had some kind of influence over their beliefs might have been harder to correct with a refutation. We also want to note that a single refutation might not have a large impact on misogynistic attitudes as a whole. So while we were able to reduce misogyny or misinformation, we weren't able to reduce the misogyny. And even if we were able to, it would have been for one specific claim, not for misogyny as a whole. We wanted to point out the two primary implications of our findings. Firstly, that misinformation can be reduced using digital tools such as TikTok, specifically in our case, the stitching function, and also that prioritizing a content-centered approach is really important when reducing misinformation. As you saw in our results, the refuter characteristics had much less to do with how people received the information. It was all about the content that they said. Thank you so much, and we look forward to discussing more in the Q&A.
Thank you very much. This was very interesting. I'm very impressed by your creative and rigorous methodology. Well done. This is really, really interesting. So our next presentation will be delivered by Gwen Bouvier and our one and only, the man responsible for today's event, Samoilenko, Sergei Samoilenko. So cancel culture, the victim as lightning rod for trigger-ready cancelers.
Hello, everyone. All right. So this presentation is about character assassination and cancel culture. While not all character attacks intend to ostracize people or exclude them from the narrative space, like cancel culture campaigns, a lot of cancellation campaigns actually have to do with character attacks and harassment and name calling and many things we talked about today. So there's been a lot of research done lately on this overlap between two concepts, character assassination and cancel culture. So I contributed a chapter on the implications for public relations theory on those two terms. Jennifer just published a couple of very interesting articles on the subject. One of them is in that wonderful book that all of you have to order for your library at the end of this conference called The Handbook of Social and Political Conflict. But who would be a great person to contact if you really don't really know much about cancel culture is Gwen Bouvier. Her article on racist callouts on social media got over 300 citations, if I'm not mistaken, in the last 4 years since it's been published. So really admirable. So here we are, myself and Gwen, we're going to talk about this cancel culture research that she's done. And yeah, Gwen, you have the floor.
Let's see. It works. Sergei, you can change the slides, please. That would be really amazing. Right. So
I can do that.
Yes, please. Next slide. Has anyone here, not heard about Johnny Depp and Amber Heard? Because that would change, that would save me a slide, basically. Yeah, we all knew that one. Yeah. Okay. So it was very. Okay. So there were two celebrities. Yeah, it was two celebrities who had a very kind of public falling out because it was a court case for defamation, which was to do with domestic abuse and slander. And yeah, for 6 weeks, we could follow live the court proceedings. And it's generated a lot of social media coverage, which was very polarized and yeah, quite impressive. So, yeah, this is kind of what it looked like. It's always good to show some data. As you see, there's lots going on here. Amber Heard and all of that, if anyone remembers. Issues of Me Too, misogyny was brought in, all sorts. Yep. See, I'm rushing through this. Now, Yeah, thank you. What should we notice? What are we really looking at when we see this kind of chaotic reaction online? Well, it's not that hard. If we look at the literature, which has looked at, how viral things are discussed like this, then we find that these kinds of personal attacks often are paired with very cruel humor and other incivilities. You get a lot of very kind of extreme how do you say, reactions that flow to the top, because if you say something moderate, it's not that interesting, is it? Also, it is not in the interest of these platforms to allow us the space to have a really good discussion where we, build on top of each other's ideas and then exchange and maybe find some common ground. That is not what social media was made for. Rather, it was to track us and to keep us busy and entertained for as long as possible. So indeed, what we find then is that online social media spaces end up just being this kind of there's a lot of vagueness, there's a lot of simplification and abstractions and, as we said already, buzzwords and vernaculars, which is the idea that you keep doing the same thing to signal that you support something like cutting the hair for the women of Iran, yeah, or the ice bucket challenge, whatever. So we know all of that already from the literature. What then did we get here? And what was the point of this study? Well, we really wanted to see if the kind of viral feed here, how really cancel culture works or fails to help us have a good conversation in society. Because, these are some very important issues after all. We have domestic abuse and cross-accusations, quite complex. And if we are going to do more and more of our communication online, which we do, yeah, is that then a good thing for our society? Or are we not? Doomed, yes, exactly, doomed. So the aim is to understand how this side-taking and simplifications take on a very particular form on social media, and where we probably are going to end up seeing exactly what the literature suggests, very heterogeneous, vague and fragmented propositions. Right, so what did we do? We're going to use multimodal critical discourse analysis to look at the representations and the discourses there put out there, and then see how they are recontextualizing what we can know of reality. Let's see, first figured out using online, I always use words, sorry. Online ethnography, there you go. Figured out what the important hashtags were, collected 40,000 tweets. Yes, that was hard work. And then applied thematic analysis following Van Dijk and Machen and Meyer. And we, what did we do with them? Yeah, basically we ended up with categories that reflect what people were saying, what kind of discourses they were putting forward as regards what was discussed here. So what I'm going to show you in results of, in terms of findings, yes, are representative examples of these categories. So what kind of shape or form did the cancelling of Johnny Depp and or Amber Heard take? Well, the first is, there was a lot of heterogeneous issues being discussed. Now, I have my lovely assistant here who will elegantly read out some these examples. Yes, the first one.
Johnny Depp really have a pure and genuine heart after everything Amber Heard has done to him. Well done, Captain Jack Sparrow. I salute you. Check out Kitten Depp's video.
Yeah, everyone here wants to know about Kitten Depp, right? Okay, so what we see here is it's a character attack, but it's not kind of based upon any clearly laid out positions, but it's rather about buzzwords and symbolism and, basically fandom, because it's not like Captain Jack Sparrow, the character in the movie, makes you know who Johnny Depp is. It doesn't work quite like that. The next category we found was that there was a lot of use of the collective we. Now, suppose that I would say, we all like to drink here. What does that mean? That you can't really say, well, I'm sober, actually. No, because I just kind of incorporated you. So it manipulates social relations. Take it away, Sergei.
The world heard you, Johnny Depp, and justice has finally prevailed. We all, including the US courts, believe and stand by you. May you heal from the years of abuse Amber Heard has outed through. May you feel the warm love everyone in this country is sending you. You are free.
Love heart, love heart. Okay, great. So what we see here, we get a sense of collective mobilization. And also if we have this we, which is inclusive of the people who are canceling, there's of course that also creates an other, in this case, Amber Heard is getting it in the neck. There was a lot of simulated face-to-face conversations. Now, most of the posts on social media actually don't try to engage in discussion. It's more like, this morning I had an apple, very kind of one-way statements, right? So we did, however, have quite a lot of simulated face-to-face conversations. Sergei.
Oh my God, you guys, you just
Excellent.
finished recording the Amber Heard after burned reading for the channel. And oh my God, you guys, you're gonna love this one. Crazy how CARP pinpointed her so well. Let me finish editing just a touch and I'll get that one up today.
Yeah. So who is you guys here, you think, Sergei? We don't know, right? It's just a simulation of like an engagement.
Y'all.
That's what we get here. And there's the promise of fun, right? Against this nemesis that we all seem to hate. And of course, there's the driving traffic to the channel. But what is not here, we're not seeing any clear setting out of arguments why Amber Heard is bad. You know, rather there's this feeling that we're participating in a form of activism, but it's all through symbolism, right? Now, we also saw a lot of foregrounding of mental states and feelings. You're on a roll here.
The warm love everyone in this country is sending you. We know who's been paying for the Twitter hashtags. We all knew this would happen. We're all screaming, all offended. The world heard you.
The world heard us. So there's no reference to facts or any clearly laid out points here, obviously. But rather, what do we get? We get a very a sense of authentic expression here of feelings. So there's an emotional engagement. It's very driven by affect, if you will, which is also very typical. And there's all of that kind of coalesces in this affective flow where there is a sense of togetherness. But what we are together about, that's not clear because there's no laid out positions. All right, and then finally, there is outrage and a savoring of a sense of power. Go for it.
Johnny Depp has been a shriveled beep, beep. However, and always will be, yes, Johnny Depp won his trial. Amber Heard, such a narcissistic beep.
Excellent beeping. Yeah, well, very good. There's almost a competition here for saying the most kind of cruel jokes. It's trolling, basically. And it's bringing a nemesis to justice. So all of this, as we can see, is a lot of fun. Yeah, people are having fun here, and it's very performative. But what it is not doing is defining the issues that are underlying this. And if we don't have a definition of the problem, yeah, that there can maybe be female abusers, or that people's relationships can just get nasty because in the end, we don't know what's going on here between these two. You know, if we don't formulate exactly or define what is going on, we cannot propose any solutions either. So clearly that is a problem here. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, the findings here reveal how cancelling at its level of intensity bear very little relationship to what actually happened. The transgressions of these people, we don't even know them, really. We think we know them because everyone followed the, at least part of this juicy kind of reality TV from the court. But the hashtag feeds then become this kind of, entanglement of really things that are not very clearly laid out. And it relates to, you know, fandom, as we've seen. There can be issues of gender and abuse and conspiracy. And it just coalesces in this growing outrage of people who, we've coined, are trigger ready. Now, what does it mean to be trigger ready? Well, basically, it's like people who are out there and who already have their own set of issues that they have a beef with. And then when they see something, what they see is not that important, is what the paper is suggesting. It's that they have their own fragmented concerns, and whether or not they actually are that related to what is actually going on here is not that important. Rather, these celebrities in this case become like a lightning rod for attracting all sorts of outrage and fist shaking. So the flow of outrage on these hashtag feeds is directed at these perceived perpetrators and their identity and what really happened, the circumstances, all of that just becomes set aside. That is not important here. It is important to have this outrage, to have this anger. So I think we can conclude that is doom for our society. Yes, I like to end in doom.
Doom.
Doom. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. This was very interesting. Amber and Johnny, thank you. And great performance, both of you. So our final presentation in this set by Tyler, Minnesota Nice, Leadership, Sexism, and Attacks on Amy Klobuchar's presidential campaign. So Tyler, please, the floor is yours.
Okay. I don't have a co-author, but maybe I can bring Sergei on board and read my slides and join the team here. Thank you, everyone. Let's just make sure the clicker is working. Great. Okay. On a snowy Sunday back in February 2019, Minnesota Senator Amy Klobuchar announced her candidacy for the Democratic presidential nomination. Most of the media coverage that she received at the time, before and after the event, was pretty positive, focusing on her personal story, focusing on the policy issues that she had hoped to bring to the forefront of the debate that would take place within and across parties over the next year and a half. However, there was one negative narrative that threatened to hobble her efforts in their infancy. This narrative was the idea that Klobuchar was, to put it bluntly, a horrible boss, that she had consistently demeaned staffers over the better part of a decade, that she was abusive, that she was wrathful, and that wrath was so voluminous that it created, as the quote in the subhead says here, an anxiety that permeates the office. With those broad claims came some very vivid anecdotes about the extent of this demeaning behavior. The time when Senator Klobuchar supposedly threw a binder, and that binder just so happened to make contact with one of the staffers. The time when one of the people who worked for her brought her a salad to eat, but didn't give her utensils with which to eat that salad. So the senator, I guess this is very entrepreneurial on her part, ate the salad with a comb, gave the comb to a staffer to clean, and then returned to her. Also, unsurprisingly, I guess, given the circumstances here, she also supposedly yelled at the staffer. Eventually, this story becomes not just about the moments of anger, but also about their broader impacts. The fact that the anger was so problematic that powerful party insiders had to rebuke her for it. The idea that this was not so much an inside secret anymore was enough of a problem as to where she was struggling to attract talented professionals to work with her on this presidential effort. And then finally, perhaps coming full circle, the idea that the stories about her temperament perhaps were overriding any of the sort of positives that she had hoped to get out of the launch and the days after. In fact, if you look at Google Trends from February 2019, you will find that this story is to some extent borne out. So if you look at the top trends involving Senator Klobuchar from that month, you will see the sorts of searches that we would expect to see with someone who decides that they're going to run for president. But then if you look at the rising searches, you see salads and combs and so forth. However, with narratives, unsurprisingly, come counter narratives. And there were also a series of pundits who very quickly, in the aftermath of the release of these types of stories, claimed that, in essence, the scandal itself was built upon a foundation of sexism. As the headline from this article describes, hidden sexism, another article at the time, and there are 4 to 5 articles that kind of make somewhat similar points along these lines, suspiciously sexist perceptions of Klobuchar's management style. The idea that it's no coincidence that if you look at these sorts of worst bosses in Congress lists, the people who have the most turnover in the amount of staff, it's women, all at the top. The top 7 women, or the top 7 senators on the list, all women. The idea that if a man were in the same position, this may not even be a story, or this might somehow end up being sort of a positive revelation of who he was and how he does his job. Would it be the opening to a New York Times story over a decade later? Probably not. The research questions I get at in this project are threefold. The first is a very sort of straightforward, let's examine the potential impacts of this attack on the candidate who is being accused of these misdeeds. I'm interested in this specific story because in some ways it is kind of a very unfamiliar, strange, unique kind of attempt at character assassination. When we think about elected officials getting in trouble for what they do on the job, we think about the speeches they give or the votes they cast, the decisions they make. We don't think of them as sort of HR professionals who have to manage a staff. Politician as employer is not really a common scandal type. However, in some ways, this is sort of a unique twist on a classic idea in politics. If you can't lead your staff, what does that say about your ability to lead the nation? You can almost write the ads themselves very quickly there. Also, there's sort of a tradition in the literature on scandal and opposition research about the power of contradiction in diminishing our opinions of elites. There is a concept, and I'm a Midwesterner, so I'm tangentially familiar with this concept. We have a Minnesotan in the room here, so you may be willing to speak to this a little bit more in the Q&A, but there's this concept of Minnesota nice. It's enough of a concept as to where it has its own Wikipedia page. But it's this idea that people from Minnesota are courteous, reserved, mild-mannered, friendly, they're averse to confrontation, they are disinclined to make a fuss or stand out. And the type of scandal I've sort of described here sort of cuts against the grain when it comes to this concept. It's not just a concept, though. It's sort of an idea that the senator had tried to wear in some ways, and it was enough of a relationship there as to where the New York Times described her as the embodiment of Minnesota nice, obviously before all of this information sort of trickled out as her campaign launched. I'm also interested in exploring, would we actually feel differently about a man who exhibits similar behavior? And in what ways might these claims of sexism might be a sort of attempt at or a possible strategy toward image repair? As we know, there's a ton of literature, endless literature on gender gaps in power and politics, all the way from when we're recruiting men versus not recruiting women to run, how we feel about where men and women should fit on the ideological spectrum, the traits they should embody, how they should do their jobs, or even like who's more susceptible to what types of scandal and who can get away with or who can exploit what types of image repair strategies more readily than others. This is my 4th time speaking at a CARP conference, and if you've heard me speak before, you probably know where I'm headed in terms of the back half of the presentation, which is let's run a survey. Let's do an experiment. And so I'm going to take a quantitative stab at answering some of these questions. And I do so through presenting survey respondents with a simulated news story that hits most of these beats of bad behavior on Klobuchar's part. I've got 3 groups of survey respondents. The first group of survey respondents is getting at that initial question here of the types of impacts that an attack like this might have. And so these individuals read a story about a fictional politician, very similar to Amy Klobuchar, who was thinking about running for higher office. This is just a visual of what the first 2 paragraphs of this story look like. The name of this fictional politician is State Senator Penny Wilson. Keep the name in mind just because it's going to come up the further I get down the line here. But the story presented these survey respondents with a wide variety of misdeeds, most of which I have not even gotten into yet. It's just horror story after horror story here. You know, it's like, I think I used the phrase habitually demeaning at the beginning here, but imagine waking up in the middle of the night to see an email that said you're the worst. Imagine being called on the carpet for using staples when you were in, so like a ton, a wide variety, a broad spectrum of potential misdeeds or traps that these staffers fell into. So this first group of survey respondents reads this story about the attack, and then they're asked to evaluate that state senator across a battery of traits. And what I want to point out here, I'm not going to dig too deeply into these numbers at this point, is the idea that this is unsurprisingly the kind of attack that is very impactful on how the public reacts to someone in a situation like this. It's a scale from 1 to 5. So you'll see with a lot of like the high 3s and 4s here that these survey respondents thought that this state senator's expectations were too high. They saw her as emotional. They thought she was a horrible boss and a slightly less horrible state senator, but still it seemed to have effects on how she did her job a little bit more broadly. And they also thought it was the type of story that should affect voters who were thinking about her gubernatorial campaign at some point. Also, interestingly, they didn't think that the staffers were overreacting, and they didn't think that this type of treatment didn't matter. Okay, so the survey becomes a survey experiment when I focus on comparing these individuals to a second, distinctly different set of individuals who read the exact same story, except I changed all the pennies to Pauls. So group 2 is reading a story about a state senator named Paul Wilson, who has taken part in the exact same list of bad behavior. And what I find when I compare these 2 groups is, perhaps surprisingly, given some of the arguments made by those pundits pushing the counter narrative that I talked about a few moments ago, that there's no significant differences in how these 2 groups react to this scandal. At least at the 0.05. I think there's like one case here where it's significant at 0.09, but I'm not going to count that. So like in every case here, the differences between how group 1, who we're calling baseline penny here, and the group who read the story about the male in the exact same case, no significant differences in how they reacted across any of these 10 figures here. Finally, a third group. Let's take what group 1 read there, this baseline penny group, and let's add that counter narrative. Let's take that story that they read, and let's add a paragraph or 2 near the end that pushes the idea that even the concept of this scandal has some sexism at the root of it. So the third group got these 2 paragraphs here at the top of the page, the idea that Wilson was being held to a different standard because of sexism. All of these, by the way, are exact pull quotes from the stories written about Klobuchar in February 2019. So that third group got this extra information, sort of pushing the idea into their brains that maybe sexism is at least part of, if not at the core, of why this is an issue. And we've got a handful of instances here in which that group that reads about sexism as being part of, at the core of how we think about this scandal, felt differently than the people who read the story about Penny and did not have sexism sort of incepted into their brains at the moment there. And the 4 instances in which there were significant differences across these groups, that group that read about sexism, unsurprisingly perhaps, were more likely to buy the idea that sexism led to some different standards here. People in the baseline group didn't seem to come up with that on their own. The people who read the sexism counter-argument or counter-narrative were more likely to see the state senator as having high expectations of staff. They were significantly less likely to deem her as a horrible boss. And finally, and perhaps most importantly for someone in this situation, they were less likely at a significant level to think that this story should affect voter decision-making as this woman tried to climb the ladder. So in sum, I find that, yes, this is the type of character attack that can impact how we feel about a politician. It's likely that Klobuchar took a hit as a result of a story like this. Didn't find support for this idea that we would treat a man differently than a woman in this particular scenario. Finally, also, you have to make the claim that there's sexism here. You can't just sort of rely on people to come to that conclusion on their own. The last thing I want to point out, and this is something that I thought of a little bit before I made this presentation, but it really sort of came to mind again yesterday when we listened to the keynote from Michael LaRosa, was that there's potential importance in who's making the claim to push back against the attack here. And so Senator Klobuchar was asked about these stories in a New Hampshire town hall a few weeks after she announced. Like, here's the question from someone in the audience. This is like a softball over the plate here. Is there an aspect of your leadership or communication style that you would like to improve on? And she responded, am I a tough boss sometimes? Yes. Have I pushed people too hard? Yes. But I have kept high expectations for myself. I've asked my staff to meet those expectations. It wasn't the senator herself that was pushing back against the idea of this story by claiming that sexism was at the root of the reporting. Instead, and very consistently, if you read these stories, it's a staffer who was referred to us by the Klobuchar campaign said, insert the idea that sexism is at the root of this. And like sometimes it's current staffers, sometimes it's people who used to work for her in the past. And so I was reminded of this yesterday when Michael was talking about the idea that it wasn't Dr. Biden who was the one coming out very strongly against the op-ed. Instead, it was people around her or like sort of broader surrogates within the Democratic Party. So I think it's interesting in hindsight as well to consider the extent to which who makes the claim that pushes back against the troublesome narrative might matter in terms of the extent to which we buy it and the extent to which it repairs the image. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope we have time for a few questions. Yes, so it was a very interesting panel, so I think there will be plenty of questions. So.
Thank you so much. Mine is for stitching refutations. So as already mentioned, like really great presentation, but I just wonder about the cyclical issues that may arise through misinformation refuting on social media platforms like TikTok. In which sources who lack credibility stitch or respond to misinformation, therefore creating more misinformation. I just wondered if you've come across any of that in your research.
Do you want to talk about your other study? Okay, I can generalize, but Dr. Bodie, who we did this class with, did another experiment the year before that was kind of looking at this and seeing if like you needed a kind of credible source, and they had someone wearing like a doctor's garb with a diploma in the back, seeing if people were more likely to believe someone who's perceived as credible than a layperson. And I believe that it had no effect. So I think, yes, that is a serious concern. I don't know if our research necessarily has an answer to that, but I think especially on social media where people are increasingly encouraged to entrust like the casual layperson approach, it can really, really dangerously have this cyclical effect of misinformation, which is why understanding like how to refute it. And in our case, we found that it was more about the content than the refuter is so important because our findings kind of show that anyone can be doing this refutation. And it's really important that someone is doing that work. Thank you.
Please introduce yourself.
Hi there, my name is Scott. I'm about to be a PhD student at George Mason. One question I had, and this is more so for the last speaker, what is the boundary between deliberate character assassination and the releasing of a simply damaging story for the sake of informing? One that comes to mind that I think is interesting for this is the story of like Arnold Schwarzenegger and how they released after his time being a candidate, the story about how he had cheated on his wife and like had gotten like a staffer pregnant.
Yeah, I think the sort of lines of language here are interesting because this becomes a story because of kind of straightforward news reporting. And then in the days after, you can start to sort of see it get weaponized by people who even, 12 months before any votes were being cast in an Iowa caucus, were trying to bring someone down. So, others in the room might have a firmer foundation on which to meet these arguments, but I don't know that it necessarily feels like character assassination when the New York Times is running the story. But if you look at the quotes from former staffers, you can kind of sense a motivation behind delivering those quotes that might fall into that category of character assassination. Since I have a mic, can I ask a question? I'll take your prerogative. I have a question for the Stitching Refutations paper, which is and I'll hand you the mic. I am curious as to how you decided on this fitness gym message as the message that you wanted to infuse into the videos you were creating. And if you think there are certain like strengths or weaknesses to that choice versus like the million other issue ideas that you could have come up with.
I'll attempt. So to begin with, like this was more of an iterative process because as we mentioned, we did this in class. So we all sort of like pitched a project on misinformation and we kind of metamorphosed it into whatever like we presented today. So there was a lot of interest in manosphere communities and humor. And we felt like we wanted someone like super unlikable. And I think that, yeah. And then this was somehow, this became like a pressing issue. We're talking about manosphere communities, what are sort of like slander. And I think it was someone else also pitching in these ideas of like multimodal affordances and being sassy. And I think that's how we ended up on the health gym. I don't know if.
Can I ask a quick, is that a real argument that people were making online?
This is a real man. Yeah.
Oh, it's real. Okay. Is that like a one-off guy making that kind of argument, or is that like a really popular argument that you see made? I see a big thumbs up there into a popular argument. Okay.
I thought it might have been one of the deep faked over, but I laughed so much when I heard that video because I've not seen that video, but I feel like I've seen, endless other short Instagram reels and TikTok make the same type of claim.
Yeah, I'll try to quickly answer both of your questions. I think the reason that we ended up going with this was because we worked on this with 15 other co-authors. So we were trying to make sure everyone's interests were represented. But we also really struggled to find a claim that we could disentangle the misinformation and the misogyny clearly. And this felt like something that it's very clearly just misogyny to say that women are responsible to take care of their bodies and born trying to look a certain way, where I think some of the other misogynistic misinformation claims online, there's a bit of kind of a blur between where's the misinformation, where's the misogyny. And then to reiterate, I do think, unfortunately, that this is a popular stance online. And while it is kind of like insular within certain communities, that doesn't mean that it's not widespread. Thank you for asking.
Hi, I'm Emily. This is for Tyler. Do you think the gender of the presumed author matters as far as credibility? Mark Bauer, I think, is the made up author of the. Oh, great. Because if a woman were critiquing this male boss, would it be perceived as like, oh, she's vindictive? Or would there be different interpretations? That's just something I thought of, that Mark Bauer as sort of generic author, if you were to play with two different names there.
He'd be tickled that we're talking about him right now. No, I do think that if you look at the headlines that I put in my presentation that sort of captured that counter narrative that sexism was at the root of this, it was almost entirely women who were writing those stories. And that, at least in sort of like the dialogue about these stories was something that people were, oh, this is just women claiming sexism.
Yeah. Oh, but a man noticed
Exactly,
it.
like a
Must
man would
be
never
really
write this. Yeah. So
incredible.
it's possible that it's one of those just sort of variables within an experiment that you have to explain away in a conclusion, I guess. But I think you're right to say that even sort of the impetus to write on some, like, the impetus to be a pundit on these types of stories might be gendered in some ways as well.
And lastly, your whole presentation kind of reminded me as a parallel example of Ellen DeGeneres. And I'd be curious in celebrity versus politics, because it came out that she was like a bad boss, demeaning. And so I'm curious, in many ways, she was canceled versus Amy Klobuchar was able to kind of resuscitate public image.
You're helping me write my lit
Yeah.
review here.
So there you
Thank
go. I don't know if anyone's written on it, but.
Okay, we have one question over there. Yeah, two more, and then we have one
Yes.
here, and then.
Okay, so
The
I
boss
have
does,
yes, you actually and Gwen. You mentioned a lot that we pronoun as an indicator of collectivity and belonging. So the emphasis in the we, it seems to me like a rhetorical strategy as it is the identification. So in this context, in order to create the common feeling of belonging to the audience, do you believe that these enhance the cancel culture phenomenon more than other verbal techniques, and therefore to result to rhetoric of hate either for the one involved person or the other?
Thank you. Actually, this is something that I used in the paper, a theoretical model which was developed by Van Dijk, and it's called the ideological square. And the idea is that you have the square, and like the people who are we are on one side and the perpetrators are on the other side, and you can't cross over. So whatever is positive will go to the we, and whatever is negative, or sometimes exactly the same qualities as that is positive for the we, will be negative for the they and the others. So it's just a rhetorical strategy, you could say. It's typical for critical discourse analysis to look at who is this we and how is it used in a way to manipulate, if you will. Yeah, I hope that answers your question. Can I keep this for my question for Josh? Yeah, oh yeah, but well, you know, everyone gets to have a question. Okay, so basically, this is going to be like very, very unpopular because we're sitting in the middle of the US. But coming from a cultural studies background from the UK, we have actually been learned not to assume media effects and influence, which of course with your inoculation, which is a term, you know, smack bang in the middle of that, it's important. But do you think you need it here? Do you think you need these media effects and influences to base this idea on of what you're doing? Because you know, if you assume effects, and in a way, if it's uncritically used, then you might lose a lot of the complexities of what is really going on there with people, because they might actually just choose whatever to believe from a limited range of ideas that they're presented with, for example. Or, yeah, people might actually also be making up their own minds, of course, and, you know, not all people react in a certain way because they already have ideas.
Yeah, no, that's thank you for that question. I think my initial response has two parts. One would be that inoculation theory is certainly not contextually bound to any one culture, to any one channel, to any one media, to any one participants. We found inoculation affects to cross contexts and cross issues. In fact, some of the strongest inoculation effects have been found in interpersonal contexts. So not mediated messages, but instead how we engage in dialogue with one another, how the back and forth of giving counter arguments and refutations doesn't in all contexts in fact, not in many contexts, change people's minds. It entrenches us into the positions that we had going into that conversation, because their responses to that were like the viruses. Our refutations of that were the antibodies to those viruses, therein causing the position to become more and more entrenched. And my second response would be, I'm a huge component for inoculation theory research. Not so much a huge proponent for inoculation theory. I think inoculation theory is an amoral tool. It's a hammer. I can build something great with it, and I think all those campaigns that we did to help kids not smoke and not drink is great. But I would not argue that all uses of inoculation have been healthy or productive. It's one of the biggest differences when it comes to medical inoculation. It's hard to find. Well, I guess you could find a case in which the body had an autoimmune disorder that was compounded by the treatment, but we're stretching the analogy just a bit too much there. But a lot of cults use inoculation. Some of the political candidates who have used inoculation have used it for harm, I would argue. I think that study that finds that you can inoculate people's support not to waver in the face of American militaristic involvement in foreign countries, I wasn't applauding that finding. I think that securing support for some procedures is not in the best interest. So, great question. I skirted it. And I guess my 2.5 response would be that the good empirical studies that are controlling for all of these variables, like pre-existing attitudes, gender, age, ideology, all of those things, gives me more confidence that the findings that we're finding, there's something there.
Thank you. So one quick last question. Yeah? Yeah. Still.
Just a quick comment. First of all, I think this was one of the best entertaining presentations panel, right? So kudos to you. And we know Dartmouth has a very good debate team, and School of the University of Oklahoma is showing through. And I'm so happy to see Michael Pfau's followers, still alive and well. And thank you for the presentation. I do have a comment and a question for your paper, because I think it kind of generated a lot of responses. I'm wondering if the topic that you chose was just not the best topic to really see the differences that you haven't seen there. So I will encourage you to think about maybe if you going into that, and I don't know, maybe you had other groups there testing it, maybe there were other more interesting topics to look at the misinformation specifically. And one of the reasons I think about it is that perhaps this particular TikTok, and that's another reason why it's so popular, is just so obviously wrong, right? And it's entertaining in itself. And so it does now crosses into not being a misinformation, but crosses into this weird, oblivious entertainment value. And we do know the research shows that one of the reasons why we share information, especially Gen Zs and share information on social media, is to be entertained. Something that they found, regardless of whether it's true or not, something that they find entertaining, or something that is really out there and absolutely shocking that they want to share, or it's something that is inside the group kind of joke, right? So something that you want to share just because, oh, look at that, how stupid that is. And so my question to you is, what are your thoughts on what would be the better maybe messaging to test, what you really want to test?
Before I hand you the microphone, I must disagree. I don't think it's obviously wrong for a broad group of audience. So I'm going to hand them to answer your argument.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and we actually did look at engagement in our study, but we didn't report on it because we found the same limitation of maybe people are just interested in sharing this because they hate the original poster. But I think I do have to disagree with it not being as valuable because it's entertainment. Because I mean, look at the president of the United States, who's constantly proliferating misinformation claims that are based in entertainment.
No, I think entertainment. I think that's point I don't argue with. I'm just saying that it's shared because it's entertaining, not because of the people believe that women should not exercise.
For sure. I just want to clarify that we weren't necessarily focusing on shares. We were focusing on refuting. So specifically in the context of correction rather than spreading for entertainment. But thank you.
All right.